great to be here, and I'm only sorry that this session is happening virtually online and not actually in St Michael's Withington itself, as was intended. And hopefully you'll be able to come and have a look and see it at some point in the future, perhaps next year when you're around. But I will do my best to make this sort of a virtual tour in replacement for that, and really run through what has happened there, the lessons from that, and sort of share some of those learning lessons with you in there, and share some of the challenges we had around what we did, which is now 10 years old. So we can use the benefit of hindsight and lessons that we've had from those last 10 years and share those with you, as well as what's happened in another church, which is all of 3 miles up the road, in St Andrews in Chedworth, which has also sort of learnt from Withington and also provides some learning to them. It will be no surprise to many of you to note that perhaps my history has been that I lived in Withington and then I moved to Chedworth. So you can draw your own conclusions from why those 2 churches are being presented as the case studies. Very welcome to have any questions and comments in the chat box. I do have that running on the screen to my left-hand side, so hopefully I can see what is coming through on that as I speak, and any queries and questions that you might have. So, St Michael's All Angels in Withington. This is the church, what you would see if you were to walk up the path today. And really the sort of the question that I pose at the beginning of when I start to speak about this project is, actually, is this building an impossibility to treat and to convert into a building that can be very positive with the future that we must all embrace, and that is one where we emit no carbon emissions? So perhaps this is too difficult. It's a grade 1 listed building. It's in an area of outstanding natural beauty in the Cotswolds. It's in a conservation area. It's 900 years old. I suppose it's fairly typical for a rural Cotswold church or a rural church up and down the country, in that it's predominantly used for Sunday worship, congregation around about 30, although packed out at Christmas and Remembrance. It has, or did have, a oil-fired boiler located in an undercroft just at this end of the church here, with cast iron radiators, and it had normal sort of reflector spotlights mounted high up within the nave and chancel and other areas. And obviously the oil emissions were contributing quite heavily to climate change. But St Michael's had a vision, perhaps started by the fact that its boiler was on its last legs and needed to be changed, but that made it think. And it actually wanted to do something in changing that boiler, and look wider than that. It wanted to ensure that whatever it did around sort of its energy generation was truly sustainable, not just in environmental terms actually, but also in economic terms, that the church of that size in that location could continue to afford to fuel itself in terms of its energy demands, and also had in mind to sort of fuel security, the very practical elements of having a secure fuel supply in terms of its oil wasn't being nicked, as was happening frequently in the area, but also where that fuel came from in terms of its international context. The other things it sort of wanted to be able to do was to be a catalyst. It wanted to just kind of put itself out there a bit, stick its neck on the line, if you want to put it in those terms, and say that actually, could it do something which then others could follow by demonstrating what could be possible? And it's interesting to sort of look back with the observation this happened 10 years ago, and how much following has there been in that time? And I can point to one or two examples which may have been inspired, or at least in some small part, by what happened here. The fact that the cathedral at Gloucester now has a very large PV array on it, on actually a very similar roof. Perhaps in some way it could have been motivated by what happened here. And there are some other one-off examples, but I suppose I do look back on that thinking, well, I can't point to hundreds of other churches that have become zero carbon in the last decade. And perhaps it hasn't been as strong a catalyst for that as we might have hoped at the time, but maybe its time is now coming. And the other ambition was for it to be an exemplar, to demonstrate, and we boldly said, this slide was actually taken from words that we put out 10 years ago, to demonstrate at a national level the possibilities of integrating the sustainability agenda within historic buildings. So I'm delighted to be speaking at the national DAC conference with the DEOs joining in now. It may have taken 10 years to happen, but I have spoken on the topic at many other events in the meantime. So it is nice to see that one being lived out, even at this present moment in time. So what is it we did at St Michael's? We did make it the first zero carbon church, certainly in the UK. I have been asked the question, was it the first zero carbon church in the world? I haven't found another one yet, so I'm not sure on that, but maybe it was. So this was the first zero carbon church. But how did we actually achieve that? The project consisted of kind of three main parts, and it's the first part that often gets missed in the sort of the headlines and the thinking about things. Yes, we did put in a biomass boiler, and more on that in a little while. And we did put up a large solar PV array upon the roof. So the roof now is covered in solar panels. But we couldn't have got zero carbon if we just did those two things alone. We had to do the first steps, which was to reduce the amount of energy, particularly the amount of electricity that the church was using. There just wasn't physically enough space on the roof to have put up enough solar panels to generate enough of the electricity if we'd carried on with the status quo in terms of the electrical consumption. So the very first thing the church did to kind of reduce demand was to look at its exterior flood lighting. It had exterior floodlights donated to it as part of the Millennium celebrations, and they were much cherished by the community. So whilst we can weigh up the merits of that happening or not, they were part of the church. So we looked at those, and they actually went off at 11:30 at night, and we thought, well, we'll go out and do a little bit of consultation on the wider project, but specifically ask the whole community in that village what it felt about the floodlights, and sort of maybe we could pose the idea of, could they be turned off a little bit at certain times of the year, and the timings and all these kind of things. So the questions we asked in the consultation was actually, could there be some reflection of the church calendar, and perhaps if we don't have flowers, we shouldn't have lighting. So should we be turning this off during Lent and Advent? Which was strongly discouraged, because really it was felt that those were times when the church needs to have more of a presence in the community, not potentially less, particularly with the Advent season, where it's dark and people felt that they wanted that light coming from the church. And we also asked the question of it goes off at 11:30 at the moment. Do you think we could turn it off at 11 or maybe even 10:30? And the answer, almost unanimously from everybody that responded to the consultation within the community, and that was church members and just other members of the community that perhaps didn't attend church as well, was actually didn't like any of those ideas. They thought it should turn off at 10 p.m. So even earlier than we sort of thought that might be acceptable. So that was a really interesting bit of feedback, and we certainly did turn them off at 10 o'clock at night. And that sort of gave us that first bit of saving, and actually quite a substantial piece, where a 13% saving came through. And then we still had to do more. So very easily, we could change all of the internal lighting. and reduce demand. Now, 10 years ago, we didn't quite have the LED lighting technology we do now. So we used actually a compact fluorescent lamp, which is this lamp you can see here. I have to admit now, and I know I'm admitting this to a large number of people, I was a little bit naughty. I went along and quietly changed 2 of the light bulbs at the back of the church without really telling anybody. I believe it's a list A matter, so I didn't need to get a faculty for it. So I'm probably just about okay there. And then a month later, I sort of said, well, to everybody, well, what do we think to those 2 new lights I put in? And again, the unanimous response was, what 2 new lights? I've not noticed any difference. And that really gave us the license then to get on and change all the lighting internally, which was all of the same type. And that delivers that 24% electrical saving. And then as actually we sort of went through the project and the planning, LED technology started, particularly in the floodlighting area, to become a little bit more widely available. So we also then went out and changed all the external lighting to LEDs, and that gave us a huge 42% saving off our electrical consumption. So that's what we all did first, and then we looked at the renewable generation from that. And actually ended up over-generating on the electricity. So if you do all the maths there, you can see we reduced it by a much larger percentage than the 63% that we are generating there. And the old oil boiler, which was on its last legs, changed for biomass. So a little bit more on that, because I can see some questions coming in on the biomass boiler. So I'll try and address some of those as we explain what we did. So the biomass boiler was located in the same place as the oil boiler, down in the undercroft. A little bit more on that later, but you can see it, this large red boiler squeezed in there. The existing oil boiler was in desperate need of being replaced. It was failing on a very regular basis and well beyond the end of its life. And we replaced it pretty much, like for like. It was a biomass boiler instead of an oil boiler. It was in the same place, and the output was fairly similar as well. So it's actually a 38 kilowatt biomass boiler in there, which integrated itself well with the existing wet radiator system that was in the building there. The heating demand of the building was only really for about 8 hours a week, which predominantly was for Sunday service, a service for when the school used it for 1 day a week for their assembly, and for a little bit of choir practice. That tended to be the weekly use. So it only needed to fire for 8 hours a week. That meant that actually, rather than trying to deal with the thorny issue of where to have a very large pellet store and that automatically went into the boiler, it was felt that the system of operation of this boiler was able to be such that the biomass pellets that are used to fuel it could be delivered in bags. They're sort of small sort of bags that could be man-handled. They were then taken down and stored into this undercroft area and loaded into a small hopper manually. And we thought at the time about every 2 weeks that would need to happen. So that's kind of how that sort of system was there. The great thing is that the church essentially got this boiler for free because it managed to acquire enough grants from funding applications at the time on sort of low carbon areas. Unfortunately, all those grant schemes have now changed and no longer exist. But it was doing that because it was right at the cutting edge of this sort of thing. And actually the financials and the environmental kind of attributes were strong. It was saving over 12 tons of carbon a year. And it was saving the church about £1,100. So that was all very positive. So hopefully that's addressed some of the questions on biomass. I know that someone else sort of said, well, where was the biomass sourced from? It actually was sourced from Balcas, who mainly produce their biomass from waste wood products from furniture manufacturing, and predominantly they're based in Northern Ireland, but they do have other depots around, including Bristol. So it was actually quite a local source of that. in there. And actually, when we compared it to the oil, and we thought, well, where's the oil coming from? Well, that was probably coming from the Middle East. So we kind of thought, well, even if it does come from a little bit further afield, maybe that's not quite such a bad thing on the balance of everything. So that was a bit more detail on the biomass, and a bit more detail on the solar panels. And you can see a picture of them there. The church was obviously in a traditional orientation. It has a low pitched roof over the nave, so that pitch faces pretty much due south. The medieval church builders got their orientation and everything's spot on. It was fortunate that the roof, due to the parapet, was not visible from the ground. So if I actually just go back a few slides to that first opening slide, you can see here the stone parapet and the fact that we just cannot see that roof in behind there. And I'm led to believe that the DAC chair at the time did spend a little bit of time driving around, making sure the roof could not be visible from any of the hills or any paths or anywhere else around the place, and it can't. There is a self-weighted system on there. Obviously, we couldn't penetrate through that historic roof, which is actually a copper roof there. So it's a self-weighted system on there. There is going to be surplus generation, or there is surplus generation. So that's fed back into the grid, and then there is electricity pulled off the grid at peak times when services and stuff are going on. So in some ways, we almost use the national grid as a bit of a battery on that one. But that is the solar panels up there. So that's essentially the project. But actually, what's really interesting is what we learned doing the project and what we've learned afterwards. So some of the challenges around the design and the installation that we had to overcome. That's sort of 10 years ago now. So firstly, there wasn't really any particular design or installation challenges around the lighting and the LED. So I'll very much focus on the biomass and PV for these, because that's really where we had to overcome the most challenges. So biomass boilers are much larger and considerably heavier than their oil or gas counterparts. Getting the biomass boiler down into its location was perhaps the largest of challenges, and you can see the photograph there taken from the bottom of the steps going down into the undercroft, and the boiler actually had to be sized that it just about slid down the hole that we had available to get it down, and required some quite careful lifting to get it in there. So that certainly needs to be a key part of any planning. We also had to overcome the issue about misconceptions about the heating times and the pellet usage, and concerns that we would be burning lorry loads of pellets every week, and that the heating needs to be on 24/7 to make it work, etc., etc. Which you know, that took a lot of working through in there, and a little bit more on that in a moment. The big challenge with the PV system was how to fix it, or how not to fix it, as the case may be. Obviously, historic medieval timbers, copper roof there. So you know, it was a no holes approach to the solar system. Not a single hole was drilled in the installing of these solar panels. So it has a self-weighted system, actually designed by Sinclair Johnson and Partners in terms of its structural attributes. It has simple uni-strut metal channels there, which you can get pretty much everywhere. Normal pre-stressed concrete lintels acting as a ballast around the place in there. And the only sort of I'm doing Sinclair a dreadful disservice now. The only really clever bit, but it really was clever, was the design of these pads there that distributed the weight and made sure that we didn't get any problems with sort of bimetallic corrosion and all those kind of issues, and also distributed the load properly over the roof. And that really just sits on there like a roof ladder, slotted over the top, and with the weight of everything on it, it does not move. And I have to admit, about a few months after the installation, having one sleepless night listening to the howling gale going on outside and quietly nipping up to the church the following morning to check that the solar panels were still there, and I'm delighted to report that they had not moved 1 millimetre. The other consideration that we, of sort of not drilling holes in the roof was actually to get the cable that we need to get from the roof down to the electrical system, and very much we hid this behind the rainwater goods, so we managed to come out of the rainwater outlet from the roof, and I do wish they put it around the other side because that might have been slightly more discreet, but this is the only visible cable we can see as it runs all the way down behind the drain pipe and actually goes through a vent hole at the bottom of the church and then under the floor into the correct area that we needed. So that's how we managed to overcome some of those issues that are often found and really still need to be overcome. But actually the solutions are there, and actually self-weighted systems on slightly pitched roofs are now more and more common and easier to get hold of than the bespoke design we had to do here. Then we have the sort of, that was really, the slides I've just run through were slides I've sort of run through sort of a year after the project, or even 6 months after the project. But now we have the benefit of looking at the project sort of 10 years on, and being able to reflect on that. So 10 years on, where are we? Well, the lighting has worked really well. It largely went unnoticed, instantly accepted by everybody without really any issue at all. We've only had one lamp failure, which was, I should say, a compact fluorescent lamp. So we'd now expect LED lamps to be able to last much longer. And so one failure in 10 years is really not too difficult, and was much better than previously. So that's been a big success, and just, I'm sure if you were to go there and ask most people in the church now and say, oh, how did your low energy lighting go? They'd turn around and say, what low energy lighting? It's just accepted as a total and utter norm. The solar PV system, again, has been a strong success out there. It's been largely maintenance free, other than a little bit of cleaning. There's really been no issues experienced with that at all. The church, because of when this was done and the grant schemes it received around it, the church received a full feed-in tariff as it was when it was first started, so enjoys a considerable income from that. The actual generation of the panels as well have outperformed themselves by around about 10% from the initial estimates, so that's been positive. And the degradation of the solar panels has been only sort of less than 1% per year in terms of how the output is deteriorating off them over the years. So that's really not been an issue at all. Then we come to the biomass boiler. And I've boldly put here, the biomass boiler was not a success. And I think if you were to go and ask the church, that is exactly what they're saying. In fact, I was down there yesterday taking some of the photographs for later on in this presentation. And that's pretty much what they would say. But actually, it didn't really prove to be that successful. However, I was reflecting on this in sort of preparation for this, and the sentence I put down, and I decided to leave it. Actually, it wasn't the biomass boiler that wasn't a success. The overall heating project wasn't a success because we only looked at the boiler. So the issues that sort of we had with it, there were frequent minor issues on the pellet feed. These would be annoying little things. And I noticed a question pop up, and forgive me, I'm not able to read all the questions and comments that are coming through because they're coming through thick and fast, which is great. And yes, you can certainly have a copy of these slides afterwards. I've seen that one. The issues with the pellet feeds were that sometimes you get a longer pellet or a clump of pellets that's stuck together, or yes, a few strange things in those pellet mixes as well that would block the feed system. And it would just need somebody going down there and tap a pipe or poke a stick in the right area and get it to be freed again. And that happened really just a little bit too often. I can only think of one case where actually the boiler engineer themselves had to be called out because there had been something more major gone wrong. They were all small issues, but they did occur with a frequency which I think we would have all preferred there not to have been. The other issue is the operational system that we had around that was pellets being delivered in bags and then being manually loaded into the hopper. Interestingly, we as you saw from the slides earlier, we sort of anticipated this needing to happen about once a fortnight. In fact, we didn't use as much pellet as we thought, and we managed to put a larger hopper in there than we originally thought we might be able to fit in as well, which meant that really we only needed doing about once a month to once every 6 weeks, depending on the weather. But over time, we started off with a group of probably at least half a dozen willing and enthusiastic volunteers to go and do this on a rota basis. And over time, one or two of those moved away, one or two of those then became physically unable to do that process. And we're left with just a couple of people that could do it. And that felt rather unsustainable and was becoming increasingly more difficult there. But I think the major failing with the biomass, as I said, it was focused purely on a boiler replacement. It didn't seek to address the issues with the rest of the heating system inside the church. So the heating system inside the church consisted of a number of large cast iron column radiators, either dotted right towards the back of the church or dotted right towards the front of the church, not around where the congregation sat. And therefore the thermal comfort within the church was not improved by the fact that there was now a biomass rather than an oil boiler on the end of it. It hadn't got any worse, but it hadn't got any better. And I think this really goes to highlight that actually we can't look at heating projects, even low carbon ones, as going, it's a boiler and I just need to replace the boiler. We do need to look at the entirety of the heating system within the church and really focusing on thermal comfort and making sure that is achieved, because if we're not achieving that, we're just putting a bit of low carbon generation on the end of a system that wasn't really that great in the first place, then we're not going to really solve the problems out there. And I hope that sort of sharing of that and saying that this biomass boiler wasn't really a success is not too disheartening for people, and I hope that is appreciated. I was struck by the sort of concluding comments, Novelette's comments, as I think most people were able to hear at the end of the last session, that goes, well, we may not get it right, but at least we're trying, and we can't accept the status quo as being okay. And Becky's comment that it's not someone else's job to change that. And I was thinking that is also true for these sort of zero carbon bits as well. We tried here, we didn't get it right. So hopefully the lessons from that can be learnt and haven't been in vain, and everybody can learn off that. So where is St Michael's now? Well, it's now gone on to actually install electric under pew heating system. It was actually installed at the end of 2019, which the church just turned around and said, well, hasn't really had a great deal of time to have that bedded in and run through a whole year on yet, because of obviously the periods we've just run through with the churches being closed. But the initial impressions of that for its period of when it was running from sort of early December through to March was obviously in the heating season, and it was very welcomed and has proven to be incredibly successful so far. The electric heating is installed under all pews, apart from the rear two. Draw your own conclusions about whether that's the church trying to encourage people not to always sit on the back pew, regardless of how few people are sat in front of them. But these are the pew heaters that have now been installed underneath. Interestingly, the church at the time chose not to remove its existing biomass heating system and felt that it needed or wanted to continue to have that presence for a bit of background heating, and maybe if the electric system wasn't going to work, then they could fall back on that. And I'll give some more thoughts on that later. The The PV panels continue to generate and work really well. I've seen some questions come through about, well, what is the maintenance and what are the costs on those? Really, other than somebody going up there on the roof when they're cleaning the gutters and getting a cloth and just giving a wipe over of the panels, there are really no other maintenance costs at all. They do get picked up on the 5-year annual fixed wire tests as an item that is tested electrically at that point in time. But other than that, there really is no other maintenance involved of them. They've continued to work well and give the church a good income up there. As I said, the lighting is fully accepted in there, and actually the church has continued to maintain its zero carbon status because it's over generating its electrical demands other than the heating through its PV. So there's some left in the account from the PV generation that goes a long way to providing the electricity needed for the heating, and any additional electricity it purchases through Ecotricity, which is a 100% renewable electricity supplier in there. So that is up there. And then just to very quickly share a few thoughts from St Andrews up the road. Very similar situation, had an oil-fired boiler, you can see here. Pretty much the same sort of heating system, and this was a year earlier than St Michael's went along and put its electrical heating system in. It needed to replace them. It went along and decided to go for the full electric route. Unfortunately, couldn't get solar panels on because of the visibility of the roof here. This electric heating system, again, under the pews, 2 different styles of electric heaters in there. These are the sort of brown BM thermic ones. These are the black Norral type of heaters in there. It installed some discrete panel heating. You can see one here behind the altar, which actually you can't see from anywhere else, and they've been very welcomed. As well as an example of an overhead heater here, where there was used to be a pendant light fitting, now replaced by a few tiny little spots up there to heat another area where that was deemed to be appropriate. Again, all electric heater works very well. The advantages there that it was obviously both projects were able to remove their external oil tanks. So you can see this is before and after without the imposition of that in there. And the electric heating panels where they were required being much smaller and therefore much more able to fit into the church. So you can see here some large heaters beforehand and the small heater allowing more room around the font. And obviously much more discreet than that large lump of metal there. And you can point to other areas of the church where this cast iron radiator was sitting there, and now the space without that there. And in fact, if you look very closely, there is a small panel heater located on the wall there, which is almost invisible to anybody going around the church. Obviously, if you get close to it, you can see it, but that is there as well. And that's really, to me, the advantage of actually really going for it, taking out the existing system that is there and using some of the space that creates to put in electric panels or freeing up the space for other usage. As I said, Withington didn't do that, and this is the sort of issue you kind of get. Well, really, that electric panel heaters here really wants to be under there, but because you haven't removed that radiator, you end up with this rather muddle of a number of systems there altogether. So the lessons really then from St Andrews, which is the electric heating system, just to reflect on those, and really it's only run for 2 years, but it's been incredibly successful, is that those brown heaters I showed you, the BM thermic ones under the pews, have proven to be actually the most preferred because they distribute their heat slightly wider and you don't get a sort of a line of heat with some complaints that people say that they get a hot line in the back of the leg. So they've worked really well. You may need some shorter fixing brackets on them than are routinely available, but they do make them, just push them slightly for them. But you really need to heat with electric heating, under pew heating, the whole length of the pew. If you leave large gaps, you can leave somebody without that source of heat, which can be undesirable. So don't spread them out too much. The programming control was really interesting because actually the church there wanted to kind of try and keep hold of some of the programming and control it was used to with the oil boiler and have a sort of a program with times and the rest of it. Actually, after about 6 months of operating the system, they kind of went, can we just go to something more simple? We just want a button we press when we come in because we only need to warm up for about 15 or 20 minutes before the service. And we just switch it on for an hour and then it goes off automatically. So they've moved over to that now. The supplemental panel heatings were really welcome. And the heater in the tower, which is another heater that was put in, was there, and actually we realised we didn't need to overheat that space. The bell ringers tend to make enough warmth themselves, and once you've taken the chill off, that's fine. So in sort of final conclusion, I hope that sharing those sort of 2 churches with you, both of which are now zero carbon, has helped to sort of give some thoughts. And in the spirit of my 15-year-old climate activist daughter, who often asks me very challenging questions, I kind of pose a challenging statement to you that if 10 years ago, a grade 1 listed church that was 900 years old in an area of outstanding natural beauty and a conservation area became zero carbon, and it did it 10 years ago, my daughter would ask you, well, what have you been doing for the last 10 years? So I'll leave that thought with you. And I'm happy to sort of take any questions now if they want to be posed, or can deal with those later. So thank you very much.